The bullets hit Sergeant David Kane's chest at point-blank range 3 clean shots that should have dropped him instantly. Instead, he kept charging through the gunfire, his uniform shredded, but his skin unmarked. His squad watched in disbelief as enemy rounds bounced off him like raindrops. For 6 months, Kane had been invincible in combat. Then his commanding officer found the ritual scars on his back and the ancient contract written in blood. And everything made terrifying sense. Welcome to Vaulted Secrets. Before we dive into this story of supernatural protection, impossible survival, and the moment when invincibility revealed its horrifying price, tell me in the comments, would you trade your soul for the power to protect others? And if you believe some powers come with costs too terrible to imagine, hit that subscribe button. This story will make you question whether survival is worth any price. Sergeant David Kane was supposed to die in Afghanistan 6 months ago. The roadside bomb that destroyed his convoy should have killed him instantly. Instead, he walked away from the twisted wreckage without a scratch, carrying 2 wounded soldiers to safety while enemy fire erupted around them. Command called it a miracle. Kane's squad called it impossible luck. Kane called it the beginning of his damnation. But nobody knew about the contract. 3 days before the convoy attack, Kane had been pinned down in a foxhole, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, watching his best friend die slowly from a gut shot. As enemy forces closed in for the kill, Kane had whispered a desperate prayer. "I'll give anything to save my men. Anything." Something had answered. The voice came from nowhere and everywhere, speaking in words that bypassed his ears and burned directly into his consciousness. Your soul for their protection. Your eternal service for their survival. Do you accept? Kane, watching his friend's life drain away, had said yes. That's when the contract appeared, ancient parchment that materialized in his bloody hands, covered in symbols that hurt to look at, and words written in a language older than civilization. At the bottom, a line for his signature. Kane had cut his palm with his combat knife and signed his name in blood. The moment his signature dried, everything changed. The enemy bullets that had been tearing through his position suddenly couldn't touch him. Rounds passed through him like he was made of smoke, or bounced off his skin like rubber balls. The shrapnel wounds on his arms sealed themselves shut. The pain in his chest from cracked ribs simply vanished. Kane discovered he had become something beyond human bulletproof, blade-proof, bomb-proof. But more than that, his presence seemed to protect his squad. When Kane was near his men, their injuries healed faster. Their aim improved. Their luck in combat became supernatural. For 6 months, Kane's unit had the highest survival rate in the entire theater. 0 combat deaths, minimal injuries. Mission success after mission success. Command started calling them the Lucky Squad and assigning them the most dangerous operations, confident that Kane's team could handle anything. But Kane was paying a price that his men couldn't see. Every night at exactly 3:33 a.m., Kane would feel the pull, an irresistible compulsion that dragged him from his bunk to perform rituals that he didn't understand but couldn't resist. He would find himself in abandoned buildings, bombed-out mosques, empty foxholes, carving symbols into his own flesh with his combat knife. The symbols would burn as he cut them, filling the air with smoke that smelled of sulfur and ancient graves. But by morning, the wounds would be gone, leaving only faint scars that formed patterns across his back, arms, and chest. Kane looked like he'd been branded by something that existed before humanity learned to fear the dark. His reflection began changing too. In mirrors, Kane could see things that weren't their shadows moving behind him. Figures with too many teeth standing just outside his peripheral vision. Words written in blood, appearing on walls that were clean to everyone else. But the worst part was his eyes. In the right light, at the right angle, Kane's eyes would turn completely black. Not just the pupils, the entire eye, sclera and all, would become dark as midnight. When this happened, Kane could see things others couldn't. The true nature of the war they were fighting. The entities that fed on human conflict. The reason his protection came with such a terrible price. Kane tried to research what had happened to him, using military computers to search for information. About supernatural contracts, demonic bargains, ancient protection rituals. What he found terrified him more than any enemy combatant ever could. Throughout history, soldiers had made similar deals. Warriors who became invincible in battle, but paid with their souls. Knights who couldn't be killed, but served dark masters after death. Every culture had stories of fighters who traded their humanity for the power to protect others. And every story ended the same way. When the protected died, the contract was void, and the warrior's soul was claimed immediately. Kane realized the horrifying truth. He wasn't just protected. He was being preserved until his usefulness ended. The moment his squad no longer needed his supernatural protection, his soul would be dragged to whatever hell had answered his desperate prayer. But Kane discovered something else in his research, a way to break the contract. It required a willing sacrifice. Someone had to take his place, accept the same deal, and Kane could be free. All he had to do was convince another soldier to sign their soul away. Kane refused. He damned himself to save his men. He wouldn't damn anyone else to save himself. For weeks, Kane tried other methods to break free. He attempted to destroy the contract, but it was written in something that couldn't be burned, torn, or dissolved. He tried to refuse the nightly rituals, but the compulsion was too strong. His body would move against his will, performing ceremonies that strengthened his supernatural protection and deepened his damnation. Kane even tried to get himself killed, hoping death might void the contract. He walked into enemy fire without armor, stood on active landmines, even put his service weapon to his own head. Nothing worked. The contract's protection extended to suicide. He literally couldn't die until his purpose was fulfilled. The breaking point came during Operation Crimson Dawn, a mission to extract a high-value target from a heavily defended enemy compound. Kane's squad was inserted deep in hostile territory, outnumbered 50-1, with no backup and no extraction plan if things went wrong. They went wrong immediately. The insertion was compromised, the target was a trap, and Kane's 8-man squad found themselves surrounded by an entire enemy battalion. For 6 hours, they held position in a bombed-out school, fighting off wave after wave of attacks. Kane moved through the battlefield like a force of nature. Bullets couldn't touch him. Grenades exploded harmlessly at his feet. Knife attacks slid off his skin like water. He single-handedly held off dozens of enemy soldiers, while his men repositioned, reloaded, and treated their wounded. But something was different this time. Kane could feel his protection weakening. The shadows he saw in his peripheral vision were getting closer. The voices during his nightly rituals were getting louder, more demanding. And for the first time since signing the contract, Kane felt pain when enemy fire hit him. Not injury, his wounds still healed instantly, but pain. The contract was preparing to collect its due. During a brief lull in the fighting, Private Rodriguez, Kane's youngest squad member, barely 19 years old, pulled Kane aside. "Sarge, I've been watching you for months. The way bullets bounce off you, the way you never get hurt, the way you disappear every night at 3:33. I know something's up." Kane tried to deflect, but Rodriguez pressed on. "I also know about the research you've been doing on military computers. Demonic contracts, soul bargains, protection rituals. I put it together, Sarge. You made a deal to protect us." Kane's blood went cold. If Rodriguez knew, others might too. The contract's secrecy was part of its power. Exposure could void the protection entirely. "I want to make the same deal," Rodriguez said quietly. "No." Kane's response was immediate and absolute. Why not? You did it to save us. I'll do it to save you. Because you don't understand the price. Rodriguez pulled out a combat knife and cut his palm, just like Kane had 6 months earlier. Blood dripped onto the dirt floor of their makeshift fortress. I'm 19 years old, Sarge. I've got maybe 60 years left anyway. But you've got a wife, kids, a life to go back to. Let me take this burden. That's when Kane made his choice. He told Rodriguez everything. The voice in the darkness, the contract written in blood, the nightly rituals, the gradual corruption of his soul. He showed Rodriguez the scars covering his body, let him see the blackness in his eyes, explained how the protection worked and what it cost. The entity that answered my prayer feeds on human souls, Kane explained. But it especially craves the souls of good people soldiers who sacrifice themselves for others. That's why it answers desperate prayers from people like us. It's not offering protection, it's offering bait. Rodriguez listened to everything, then asked a simple question. How do we fight it? Kane had been asking himself the same question for months. Then he remembered something from his research. Every contract had an escape clause, but it was always hidden in the terms. Kane pulled out the supernatural document that had appeared every night. During his rituals, studying the ancient text with Rodriguez, they found it buried in symbols that shifted and changed when they weren't looking directly at them. A clause written in a language that predated human writing, but somehow both soldiers could understand it. The contract may be voided if the signatory willingly sacrifices the protection to save an innocent, knowing that such sacrifice will result in immediate death. Kane understood. He could break the contract, but only by giving up his invincibility to save someone who was truly innocent, knowing that without the protection, he would certainly die. The final enemy assault began at dawn. 200 soldiers with rocket launchers, heavy machine guns, and armored vehicles. Kane's squad had run out of ammunition, medical supplies, and time. This was their last stand. As enemy forces closed in, Kane saw his opportunity. A group of civilian children refugees from the nearby village were caught in the crossfire, hiding in the school's basement. The enemy was using explosives that would collapse the entire building, killing the children along with Kane's squad. Kane made his choice. He placed his hand on the contract and spoke the words that would void his protection. I willingly sacrifice my power to save the innocent. The contract burst into flames that burned cold as ice. Kane felt his supernatural protection drain away like water from a broken dam. For the first time in 6 months, he was fully human again, vulnerable, mortal, and free. Kane grabbed a rocket launcher from a fallen enemy soldier and sprinted toward the building's structural supports. Without his protection, enemy fire immediately began finding its mark. Bullets tore through his legs, arms, and chest. But Kane kept moving, driven by the same determination that had gotten him this far. He reached the building's central support column and aimed the rocket launcher at the load-bearing beams above the basement where the children were hiding. If he could bring down this section of the building in a controlled collapse, it would create a protective pocket around the kids while sealing off the area from enemy forces. Kane pulled the trigger. The explosion brought down half the building, creating exactly the protected space Kane had calculated. The children were safe, buried under debris, but alive and breathing in a pocket of air that would last until rescue arrived. Kane, however, was trapped under tons of concrete and steel, bleeding from dozens of wounds that no longer healed themselves. As he lay dying, Kane felt something he hadn't experienced in months' peace. His soul was his own again. The shadows in his peripheral vision were gone. The voices that had tormented his nights were silent. Private Rodriguez found Kane in the rubble 3 hours later when rescue forces arrived. Kane was barely conscious, but he was smiling. Did the kids make it? He whispered. All 7 of them, Rodriguez confirmed. Rescue crews are digging them out now. Kane nodded, closed his eyes, and let go. The official report listed Sergeant David Kane as killed in action while protecting civilian refugees. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for extraordinary heroism in the face of certain death. The citation mentioned his supernatural courage and miraculous survival abilities, but attributed them to exceptional training and unwavering dedication to duty. Private Rodriguez returned home with the rest of Kane's squad. All 8 men survived the operation. Rodriguez never spoke publicly about what really happened in that bombed-out school, but he kept Kane's dog tags and a small piece of burned parchment that was all that remained of this supernatural contract. Years later, Rodriguez would become a counselor for veterans struggling with PTSD and survivor's guilt. He specialized in helping soldiers who felt they'd made impossible bargains just to survive, not supernatural ones, but the psychological contracts that warriors make with darkness when survival demands sacrificing pieces of their humanity. Rodriguez would tell them Kane's story, not the supernatural parts, but the human truth at its core. That real heroism isn't about being invincible. It's about choosing to be vulnerable when it matters most. It's about recognizing that some protections come at prices too high to pay, and having the courage to give them up when protecting others demands it. Kane's widow received his medal at a ceremony attended by hundreds of soldiers, many of whom owed their lives to her husband's supernatural protection. She never learned about the contract, the rituals, or the terrible price Kane had paid for his squad's survival. But she understood something more important, that her husband had died exactly as he'd lived, putting others before himself. The 7 children Kane saved grew up to become doctors, teachers, engineers, and parents. They never knew the soldier who died to protect them. But they carried his sacrifice forward in the lives they built and the people they chose to help. Sometimes protection requires sacrifice. Sometimes survival demands courage. And sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is give up your power when using it would damn your soul. Kane learned that true invincibility isn't about being bulletproof. It's about being willing to take the bullet when someone else's life depends on it. So I ask you, what would you sacrifice to protect the people you love? How much of yourself would you trade away for their safety? And when the price becomes too high, would you have the courage to pay it anyway? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about the protectors in your life, the sacrifices you've witnessed, or the moments when you had to choose between safety and your principles. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Vaulted Secrets. We're here to explore the prices people pay for power, the courage required for true heroism, and the choices that define who we really are when everything is on the line. Because sometimes the most important protection comes not from being invincible, but from being willing to be vulnerable for the right reasons. Thanks for watching, and remember, true strength isn't about what you can survive. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice for others.